"Anna, I'm sorry, but while you were in a coma, we sold your apartment," said my mother-in-law when I regained consciousness. But I just smirked and calmly replied, "The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and wilting lilies." I stared at the ceiling, trying to focus on the cracks in the plaster. My body wouldn't obey me. My mind worked in fits and starts, like an old engine struggling to start. How much time had passed? Days? Weeks? "She's awake," came the muffled voice of a nurse nearby. A few minutes later, 2 people entered the room. My husband Robert and his mother Margaret. He stopped by the window, not approaching the bed. She came closer, studying me intently through her expensive glasses with thin frames. "Finally, you're awake, dear," Margaret said, with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. We were starting to worry. The plastic cup of water in my hands trembled. 3 months in a coma. They said it was a reaction to the medication. Strange. I had always read the instructions carefully. "Anna," Margaret cleared her throat, "we have something to tell you." She glanced at her son, but he continued to stare out the window as if something utterly fascinating was happening outside. "You see, your treatment was very costly," she began in a businesslike tone. "The health insurance didn't cover everything, and we had to make some decisions." I waited for her to go on, feeling a heavy pressure building in my chest. "Anna, I'm sorry, but while you were in a coma, we sold your apartment," she finally blurted out, closely watching my reaction. I could almost physically feel Robert tense up by the window. He was expecting an outburst. Tears. Screaming. A breakdown. They both were. But instead, I felt a strange relief, as if the last thread connecting me to my past life had snapped, not with pain, but with freedom. "You know, Margaret, it's probably for the best," I said, surprised by the calm in my voice. "Too many heavy memories there." My mother-in-law raised her eyebrows in surprise. She had clearly expected a different reaction. Robert finally turned away from the window and looked at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. "Anna," he said hesitantly, "we didn't want it to come to this, but the doctors said the chances—" "Minimal," Margaret finished for him. "The doctors said the chances of waking up were minimal. We did what we thought was right." I gave them both a faint smile. "Of course. You always do what you think is right, Margaret." The hospital routine dragged on. Days blurred into an endless stream of procedures, checkups, and monotonous physical therapy exercises. Robert showed up rarely. Work, you understand? Margaret, on the other hand, embraced the role of the caring mother-in-law and came almost every day, bringing fruit, magazines, and her ever-present healthy herbal teas in a thermos. "You need to regain your strength, dear," she would say, watching as I sipped another cup of murky liquid with a bitter aftertaste. I drank obediently, but I poured more into the trash than into myself. A strange feeling wouldn't leave me. Something felt wrong about all this care. When Margaret left, I would pull a notebook out of the bedside drawer and write down everything I could remember about the months leading up to the coma. My memory was returning in fragments, like shards of a broken mirror. There I was, standing in front of the bathroom mirror in our new apartment, the one that's now sold. I looked at my gaunt face with dark circles under my eyes. "It's just stress from the move," I told myself, but deep down I knew that wasn't the whole story. There was Margaret in our kitchen, pulling herbal packets from her bag. "This will help you relax and get into the mindset for motherhood," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. There I was at another doctor's appointment. "You have a slight hormonal imbalance," the doctor said, studying my test results. "Nothing serious, but it could affect conception." There I was, waking in the middle of the night with sudden chills, nauseated. So dizzy I couldn't get out of bed. Robert called an ambulance. Margaret arrived before the paramedics. And then, nothing. 3 months of coma, completely erased from my memory. I remembered how it all started. 4 years ago, Robert introduced me to his family. Margaret welcomed me with open arms, the perfect future mother-in-law, attentive and caring. I was charmed. My own mother had died when I was 15, and the presence of a nurturing older woman in my life felt like a blessing. At our wedding, Margaret gave a heartfelt speech about how happy she was that her son had found such a wonderful girl. "I'm sure you'll give us beautiful grandchildren," she said, and everyone smiled sentimentally. I smiled too. Back then, it felt like only happiness lay ahead. The first year of our marriage was cloudless. We both worked, built our careers, and traveled. Then Robert was offered a promotion, a position at a branch of the company in another city. Margaret was thrilled. "This is your chance, son," she said. The move meant I would have to leave my job at a prestigious architecture firm where I had just begun to advance. But I loved Robert and believed I could find something just as good in the new place. "Support your husband now, and he'll support you later," Margaret said when I shared my doubts with her. She was the one who found the apartment for us too. "I've checked everything. It's the perfect place for a young family," she assured us. We bought it without a second thought. 3 bedrooms. "For future children," my mother-in-law said with a wink. And that's when the hints started. At first, they were subtle. "How's the job search going, dear? Maybe it's time to take a break and think about starting a family?" Then they became more insistent. "You know, after 30, it gets harder to get pregnant. Don't wait too long." And finally direct. "Robert dreams of having children. Don't you want to make him happy?" I did want children, just not right away. I needed to find my footing in this new city, to settle in, to feel confident. I talked to Robert about it, and he seemed to understand, at least until his mother would show up with her caring reminders. 6 months after the move, I found a job, not as prestigious as the last one, but with room for growth. Margaret reacted oddly. "Oh, so you've decided to work after all? What about the family?" When I explained that one didn't exclude the other, she just pressed her lips together. Then came the doctor visits. The gynecologist Margaret recommended ordered a bunch of tests after the very first checkup. "Just routine," he said. But I saw something else in his eyes, as if he already knew he would find a problem. And he did. The tests showed minor abnormalities, nothing serious, but enough to start a treatment course. Vitamins, herbal supplements, all lovingly brought to me by my mother-in-law. "I worry about you so much, dear," she said when I began to complain about constant fatigue, mood swings, and insomnia. "Maybe you should take a break from work and focus on your health." But I clung stubbornly to my job. It was my only anchor, the only thing that gave me a sense of autonomy and independence in this new city where I had no friends or connections. Now I realize that was exactly what irritated Margaret the most. She wanted me to be completely dependent on Robert, and on her, to become an obedient puppet in their family. "Anna, we found a nice apartment for you," Robert informed me during one of his rare visits. "It's small, but in a good neighborhood. Mom helped with the search." "And where are you living now?" I asked, picking at the hospital lunch. He hesitated, avoiding my gaze. "I'm temporarily staying with Mom. There's plenty of space, you know." "Of course," I nodded. "And how long have you been there?" "Since," he faltered, "since we sold the apartment." "Our apartment," I corrected him. "Yes, ours." He finally looked me in the eye. "Anna, I know you're angry." "I'm not angry, Robert," I cut him off. "I'm just trying to understand what happened while I was gone. The doctors say I have 2 more weeks here, and then what? Where do I go? To this new apartment? Alone?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that always betrayed his nervousness. I thought we both needed space, time to think things through. "Think what through, Robert?" He didn't answer, but his silence said more than words ever could. I looked at this man, my husband of nearly 5 years, and I didn't recognize him. When did he become so spineless? Or had he always been this way, and I just hadn't noticed? I remembered how we met at a contemporary art exhibit. I was standing in front of an abstract painting, trying to figure out what the artist meant, when a tall man with kind eyes stopped beside me. "Looks like an explosion of emotions, doesn't it?" he said. And I smiled because I'd been thinking the exact same thing. We talked for 2 hours, moving from one painting to another, and then for another 3 in a little cafe across from the gallery. Robert had been smart, attentive, with a great sense of humor. He listened, truly listened, when I spoke about my dreams, my plans, my fears. He supported me in everything. That is, until his mother began to actively insert herself into our lives. Now, looking at him in the hospital room, I saw only a shadow of the man I had once fallen in love with, and that hurt more than betrayal. "You know," I said quietly, "you remind me a lot of my father right now." Robert raised his eyebrows in surprise. I rarely spoke about my family. After my mom died, he just gave up, stopped making decisions, stopped living his own life, let Aunt Agatha boss him around because it was easier that way. I swore to myself I would never become like that, and never tie my life to someone like that. He lowered his head, and I saw the back of his neck flush red, a sure sign my words had hit home. The next morning, when Margaret walked into the hospital room with yet another thermos of herbal tea, I decided to take a risk. "You know," I began casually, "the doctor said I should probably avoid any herbs for now. Something to do with the new medications they've prescribed." I watched her reaction closely. Her eyes narrowed slightly, her lips tensed, but a second later, she was smiling again. "What a shame. I was really hoping to help with your recovery." "Well, I'll just leave it here then," she said, placing the thermos on the bedside table. "Maybe they'll allow it later." That evening, when a nurse came in to check on me, I asked her for a favor. "My mother-in-law left me some herbal tea, but I'm worried it might interact badly with my medication. Could you send it in for testing, just to make sure there's nothing harmful in it?" The nurse, a young woman with tired eyes, looked at me with doubt. "The hospital doesn't run that kind of test without a serious reason. Please," I lowered my voice. "I have reason to be concerned. I'll pay for the analysis myself." She hesitated. "Look," I continued, "before I fell into the coma, the only things I was taking were vitamins and those herbal teas my mother-in-law gave me. And then, this unexplained reaction. Don't you think that's strange?" Something in my tone made her wary. "You think your mother-in-law might have—" She didn't finish the sentence. "I just want to know exactly what I'm drinking," I replied. "Is that really too much to ask?" The next day, the nurse, Nina, as I learned from her name badge, lingered in my room longer than usual. "I gave the sample to a friend in toxicology," she whispered, pretending to adjust my IV. "He'll run the test unofficially. The results should be ready in a couple of days." "Thank you." I squeezed her hand. "You have no idea how much this means to me." The test results from the herbal tea were the first piece of the puzzle I had begun to assemble. In the seemingly harmless drink, they found a plant-based additive that, when taken regularly, could cause hormonal imbalances that interfered with conception. "It's not lethal," Nina explained, showing me a printed copy of the results. "But this herb has traditionally been used as a natural contraceptive. In some countries, women still take it to control fertility." "And if combined with certain medications?" I asked, my heart pounding against my ribs. "It could cause unpredictable reactions," she frowned, "especially with sedatives." Those were exactly the kind of medications I'd been taking for insomnia in the weeks leading up to the coma. "You should go to the police," Nina insisted. "Not yet," I shook my head. "I need more information and more evidence." That same day, I called my old friend Liza. We hadn't spoken since I moved to this city to be with Robert. "Anna?" Her surprised voice on the line made me smile for the first time in a long while. "Oh my God, I heard about your coma. How are you?" "Alive, as you can see," I replied. "Liza, I need your help and absolute confidentiality." Lisa worked at a law firm and had connections with private investigators. She was exactly the kind of person I needed now. "Of course, anything you need," she said without hesitation. I used the next 2 weeks in the hospital to gather information. Whenever Margaret brought new batches of her healthy drinks, I played the role of the grateful daughter-in-law, but didn't drink a drop. Instead, I secretly sent samples to Liza for testing. On my last day in the hospital, Robert came to visit. He looked nervous and somewhat lost. "I'll help you move into the new apartment," he said, avoiding my eyes. "Thanks, but I've already arranged everything myself," I replied calmly. "Lisa will help me. Remember Lisa? My friend from college." "Of course," he nodded, though I was sure he barely remembered her. "Anna, we need to talk about the future." "Absolutely," I agreed. "But not now, Robert. I need time to recover, to settle into the new apartment, to get back to normal life." He looked both relieved and guilty at the same time. "Of course, whatever you say." As he was leaving, I noticed him checking his phone on the sly. I wondered who was waiting for his messages so eagerly. The new apartment was small but functional. It couldn't compare to the spacious 3-bedroom place we used to live in, but it had everything I needed. At least Robert and Margaret hadn't left me out on the street. How generous of them. The first thing I did was meet with Mark, a private investigator recommended by Lisa. "So you believe your mother-in-law was systematically adding substances to your tea to prevent conception?" he clarified, reviewing the test results I had provided. "Yes, and I want to know why," I answered. "And what happened while I was in a coma?" Mark turned out to be a professional. In just a week, he had gathered more information than I could have hoped for. "The first thing you should know," he said during our second meeting, laying out a folder of documents in front of him, "is that your apartment wasn't sold to pay for your treatment." "Then what for?" "Most of the money was used for a down payment on a house in the suburbs," he said, handing me photos of an elegant 2-story house with a manicured garden. "The house is registered in your husband's name." I felt a lump rise in my throat. "But that's not all," Mark continued. "It looks like your husband isn't planning to live there alone." He pulled out another photograph. In it, Robert was entering the house accompanied by a young blonde woman. "Her name is Clarissa Schmidt," the detective explained. "She's the daughter of a close friend of your mother-in-law." I stared at the photo for a long time. The girl was beautiful, slender, with long golden hair and a happy smile. She was holding Robert's arm like she had every right to do so. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, surprised at my own calmness. "From what I can tell, they started seeing each other about a month after you fell into a coma," Mark replied. "But here's something interesting. Your mother-in-law introduced them even before that at various family events." "She was preparing a backup plan," I muttered. "And one more thing," Mark handed me another document. "I managed to find some information about the first wife of your husband's older brother, Elizabeth Morris. They were married for 2 years, no children. Then she suddenly got sick and was hospitalized with a diagnosis of unexplained poisoning by an unknown substance. While she was recovering, they got divorced." "And where is she now?" "She lives in Seattle. She's an artist, remarried, has 2 kids." I raised my eyebrows. "So her fertility is fine?" "Seems like it," Mark nodded. "Do you want me to arrange a meeting?" "Yes," I said firmly. "I need to talk to her in person." After Mark left, I sat on the couch for a long time, studying the photos. There were Robert and Clarissa leaving a restaurant. She was wearing a dress that showed off her slim figure. He wore a suit I had never seen before. They were both smiling. Then they were in the park, holding hands. Then walking into a jewelry store. Were they already picking out rings? Strangely, instead of the expected jealousy or pain, I felt only fatigue, as if I were watching a movie about strangers. The man in those photos was no longer my husband. Maybe he never truly was. Not really, not faithfully, not devotedly. I thought about Clarissa. How happy she seemed, unaware that she was heading for the same fate as me. That Margaret would never release her son from her grip. That any woman who entered this family was doomed to become nothing more than an incubator for producing heirs. And if she failed at that role, well, I already knew too well what happened then. Should I warn her, or should I let her find out on her own what she's gotten herself into? Elizabeth turned out to be a pleasant woman with intelligent eyes and a warm smile. We met at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. "I never thought I'd come back here," she admitted, nervously stirring her coffee. "Too many bad memories." "Thank you for agreeing to meet," I said. "It means a lot to me." She looked at me intently. "When your detective called and told me your story, I felt like I had to help. The same thing happened to me. Only I was luckier. I didn't end up in a coma." "Margaret gave you something too?" Elizabeth gave a bitter smile. "Oh yes. First it was fertility vitamins, then herbal teas, always with such care, such concern. And when I didn't get pregnant after a year, the hints started. Maybe you should check your compatibility. Maybe the problem is with you." "What happened then?" "I started to get suspicious when I noticed strange changes in my cycle. I went to a doctor behind Margaret's back. Turned out I had a serious hormonal imbalance. The doctor asked if I was taking any medications. That's when I started paying close attention to what my mother-in-law was giving me." Elizabeth took a sip of coffee and continued. "One day I pretended to drink her tea, but instead I took it for testing. When the results came back, I was in shock. It contained an herb traditionally used as a contraceptive. I confronted her. She denied everything, of course. 2 weeks later, I ended up in the hospital with poisoning." "You think it was her?" "I'm certain," Elizabeth nodded. "But I couldn't prove it. You know what the worst part was? While I was in the hospital, Craig, my ex-husband, filed for divorce. Margaret convinced everyone I was crazy, that I'd poisoned myself for attention, and no one took my side." I reached out and squeezed her hand. "I believe you." "Thank you," she said with a sad smile. "You know, it took me a long time to understand why she did it, why she hated me so much. And then, after I moved to Seattle, I came across an article about narcissistic family dynamics. Margaret is a textbook case. She can't share her son's love with anyone. Every woman who enters their lives is a threat to her, but she can't confront it openly, so she works in secret." "What about Clarissa, Robert's new girlfriend?" "Oh, I'm sure she's perfect in every way, for now, as long as she fully obeys Margaret. But the moment she starts asserting herself, she'll face the same fate," I finished for her. Elizabeth looked at me with sympathy. "You know what I realized after all of this? Craig never deserved me. If he could turn away that easily, believe lies about the woman he'd lived with for 2 years. If he couldn't find the strength to stand up to his mother, he was never a real man, and I deserved better." Her words echoed in my soul. I deserved better too, better than a life with a man who betrayed me at the first opportunity. My next step was a visit to my attending physician, Dr. Reynolds. He was surprised to see me in his office without an appointment, but he still made time for me. "Dr. Reynolds, I'd like to review my medical history," I said. "The full history." "Of course, Mrs. Clark, that's your right," he nodded. "May I ask why?" "I'm trying to understand what exactly led me to fall into a coma," I answered honestly. "My last memories are very blurry. I think going through it all might help me psychologically adjust." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "I'll arrange to have copies of everything prepared for you." An hour later, I was sitting in a small visitor room, going through a thick stack of papers. The flood of medical terms made my head spin, but I read every page methodically. According to the records, I had been admitted to the hospital with signs of acute poisoning by an unidentified substance. The initial blood test revealed the presence of several components: a sleeping pill I'd been taking for insomnia, alcohol, though I didn't recall drinking that evening, and a plant-based compound that could not be immediately identified. The patient fell into a coma as a result of the interaction of several substances in her system, the report stated. But the most interesting part was the last page, the consent form for treatment. It was signed by Robert as my next of kin. Next to it was the witness's signature, Margaret Clark. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note. The patient had been taking sleeping pills without a prescription, possible suicidal tendencies. I stared at that line, feeling a chill spread through me. Suicidal tendencies? Was that their way of explaining my condition? Trying to make everyone believe I had attempted to kill myself? At that moment, the door to the room opened and Dr. Reynolds walked in. "Did you find anything useful?" he asked. I looked up from the papers. "Dr. Reynolds, is it true that I showed signs of suicidal tendencies?" He frowned, took the document from my hands, and read the note. "That note wasn't written by me," he said after a pause. "It's Dr. Schmidt's handwriting, the doctor who first admitted you." "Schmidt?" I repeated, as in Clarissa Schmidt. The doctor looked at me in surprise. "Yes, she's his daughter. Do you know her?" The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. Dr. Schmidt, Clarissa's father, had been the first to examine me. His note about suicidal tendencies. Margaret, who had signed the treatment consent as a witness. And Robert, who had too quickly accepted the version about my mental instability. "Dr. Reynolds," I looked him straight in the eye. "I wasn't trying to kill myself. I think I was poisoned." With those words, my real investigation began. With the help of Mark, Lisa, and even Dr. Reynolds, who was shocked by my suspicions, I started collecting evidence, step by step. We obtained surveillance footage from the pharmacy, where Margaret regularly bought certain herbs and dietary supplements. We found receipts for those purchases. Mark uncovered the connection between the Schmidt family and Margaret. It turned out they had known each other for over 20 years. Dr. Schmidt had repeatedly written prescriptions in Margaret's name for medications she had no medical need for. Lisa found legal documents related to the sale of our apartment. Just as Mark had said, most of the money had gone toward the down payment on the house where Robert now lived with Clarissa. They hadn't even bothered to hide it, so confident they were that I would never wake up. But the most shocking discovery was that Margaret had started this plan long before my coma. I found video recordings from a family dinner that took place 3 months before my accident. In them, Margaret was introducing Clarissa to the family, including Robert. I wasn't there. I had been away on a business trip. "Such a sweet girl, and from a good family," Margaret said on the recording, while Clarissa smiled modestly. "And most importantly, ready to start a real family. Not like some people who only think about their career." Each new piece of evidence made me wonder, how could I have been so blind? How did I not see the web of lies that had been spun around me for years? 2 months after being discharged from the hospital, I was ready to act. The folder with all the evidence lay on the coffee table in my new apartment. Next to it, a voice recorder and a bottle of expensive whiskey, the kind I knew Robert liked. I called him on a Friday evening. "We need to talk," I said without preamble. "It's important." "Anna, I'm really busy right now." "It's about our divorce, Robert. If it's easier for you, we can go through the lawyers." The word divorce had the desired effect. He agreed to come that same evening. "Bring your mother too," I added before hanging up. "This concerns her as well." He sounded surprised but promised they'd come together. I spent several hours preparing for the meeting. I laid out the documents in the right order, positioned the voice recorder where it wouldn't be noticed, and even put on a bit of makeup. I wanted to look strong when they saw me. Exactly at 7 p.m., the doorbell rang. Standing on the doorstep were Robert and Margaret. He looked nervous. She, as always, confident. "Come in," I said, opening the door wider to let them into the small living room. "Have a seat." Margaret glanced around the apartment with an appraising look. "Quite cozy," she noted, with just a hint of condescension in her voice. "For one person, it's more than enough," I replied, pouring whiskey into 3 glasses. "Robert, I remember you prefer it without ice." He nodded, avoiding eye contact. "So," I began once we were all seated in the living room, "I invited you here to discuss a few matters." "If this is about the divorce, my son is willing to be reasonable," Margaret interrupted. "After all, part of the proceeds from selling your apartment went toward this one. I'd say the arrangement was more than fair." "We'll talk about the finances too," I nodded, placing the first document on the table, a bank statement showing the transfer of funds from the apartment sale to the purchase of the new house. "But first, there's something more important I'd like to clarify." I took out the test results for the herbal tea and placed them in front of Margaret. Can you explain why the drinks you gave me contained substances that inhibit conception? Margaret didn't even flinch. I don't know what you're talking about, dear. Those were just ordinary herbs to boost the immune system. In that case, I placed the next document on the table. How do you explain the fact that the same substances were found in the blood of Elizabeth Morris, your older son's first wife? This time, I noticed a slight twitch at the corner of her mouth. Robert looked back and forth between us, confusion growing on his face. Anna, what is all this supposed to mean? He asked. It means, Robert, that your mother was systematically poisoning me. I looked him straight in the eye. Just like she did with Elizabeth. She added substances to my food and drinks that prevented me from getting pregnant, and then used it as proof of my so-called deficiency. This is absurd, Margaret exclaimed. Robert, surely you're not going to listen to these insane accusations. Insane? I calmly placed a copy of my medical file on the table, the one marked with suicidal tendencies. Like this note, written by Clarissa's father, Dr. Schmidt, when I was admitted to the hospital? The note that helped you convince everyone I was mentally unstable? Robert picked up the document and studied it carefully. His face gradually turned pale. Mom? He turned to Margaret. What's going on here? Nothing, darling. Her voice turned sickly sweet. Your wife is simply trying to shift the blame for her problems onto others. Classic denial. Dr. Schmidt warned us about this. Dr. Schmidt, I gave a crooked smile. Your old friend and Clarissa's father. By the way, Robert, how long have you been seeing his daughter? 2 months after I fell into a coma? Or did you know each other before that? He stared at me, eyes wide. How did you... I have my sources, I said, laying photos on the table from the family dinner where Margaret had introduced Clarissa to the relatives. Here, for example. This was 3 months before my coma. Do you remember that evening, Robert? I was away on a business trip, and your mother was already picking out my replacement. Margaret abruptly stood up. I'm not going to sit here and listen to these ridiculous accusations. Robert, we're leaving. Not so fast, I said, pulling out the final document, a toxicology report on the interaction of substances found in my blood. You know what happened the night I fell into a coma, Margaret? I did take sleeping pills, a regular dose prescribed by my doctor for insomnia, and then you offered me tea to help me sleep better. That tea didn't just contain your usual fertility-suppressing herbs. It also had another substance, a valerian derivative, in a concentration 10 times higher than safe levels. Combined with the sleeping pills, it triggered a toxic reaction. Did you know that, Margaret? Or were you just hoping I'd get sick enough for Robert to finally believe something was wrong with me? Margaret went pale. That's all lies, she hissed, but her voice had lost its usual certainty. You tried to kill me, Margaret, I continued, staring her down, and you almost succeeded. When I ended up in a coma, you convinced everyone I was mentally ill, that I'd tried to take my own life. You used your connection to Dr. Schmidt to falsify medical records. And while I was unconscious, you sold my apartment, bought a house for your son, and found him a new, perfect wife. Someone who'd give you the grandchildren you wanted and be the obedient daughter-in-law, at least until she stops following orders. Anna? Robert looked stunned. Do you really think my mother could... I don't think Robert, I interrupted. I know. I have all the evidence. Blood tests, expert reports, witness statements. You know selling the apartment was the least of your crimes. Margaret looked at me with open hatred. No one will believe you, she hissed. You're just a bitter woman who can't accept that her husband found someone better. Oh, they'll believe me, I smiled. Because I don't just have the evidence, I also have a witness, your former daughter-in-law, Elizabeth, whom you did the same thing to. Copies of all documents have already been given to my lawyer, with instructions to forward them to the police if anything happens to me. Robert's gaze shifted between me and his mother as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Mom, his voice was shaking. Tell me this isn't true. Margaret looked at her son and suddenly burst into tears. I did it all for you, she whispered. Only for you. She wasn't right for you. She never cared about family. only her career. A woman like that can't be a good mother." Robert recoiled as if struck. "You ... He couldn't find the words. "You really—" "I just wanted what's best for you." Margaret grabbed his hand. "Clarissa is perfect for you. She's smart, beautiful, from a good family, and she wants children. Lots of them. Isn't that what you always wanted?" "I wanted a family with Anna," Robert said, barely audible. "I loved her, and you?" He didn't finish the sentence. He stood up abruptly and left the room. The front door slammed. Margaret and I were left alone. "What are you going to do?" she asked after a long silence. Her face had sagged, her shoulders drooped. She suddenly looked old and vulnerable. "I already did it," I replied calmly. "The documents have been turned over to the police. The report has been filed. The investigation begins next week." "You destroyed my son's family," she said, and this time her voice carried genuine pain. "No, Margaret," I shook my head. "You did. With your manipulation, your lies, and your obsession with controlling your children's lives. You didn't just destroy my life. You destroyed Robert's, and Elizabeth's before me, and who knows how many others." The following months were filled with court hearings, meetings with lawyers, and long sessions with a therapist. The court found Margaret guilty on multiple charges, including causing grievous bodily harm and falsifying medical records. She was sentenced to 5 years probation, considering her age, and ordered to pay substantial compensation. Robert broke off his engagement with Clarissa and sold the house that had been bought with the money from our apartment. He transferred half the proceeds to me as compensation, even before the court ruled on the division of property. A year later, I stood by the window in my office on the 12th floor of a business center. My architecture studio now occupied the entire floor, a spacious space with panoramic windows and a view of the city I once considered foreign. Now, it was my city and my life. On the desk lay a fresh issue of a professional magazine featuring my project on the cover. "Rebirth Through Architecture: How Anna Clark Turns Abandoned Buildings into Works of Art." I ran my fingers over the glossy paper, feeling a strange sense of irony. Rebirth. That was exactly what I'd been doing, not just in my work, but in my life. The reconstruction of the old library building had become more than a project. It was a metaphor. I remembered the first time I walked into that empty, crumbling space. Cracks in the walls, collapsed ceilings, rotting floors. A building everyone thought was doomed to be torn down. "Why this building?" clients had asked, puzzled by my persistence. "Because it deserves a second chance," I would answer. And I knew I wasn't just talking about the building. Now, with the project completed, the old library had been transformed into a modern cultural center while preserving its historic character. A new life, built on a strong foundation of the past, but no longer bound by it. I turned away from the window and glanced at the clock. In an hour, I had a meeting with Robert, our first in a long time. He had called unexpectedly, his voice unusually quiet. "I need to talk to you, Anna, about Margaret." Margaret. I hadn't said that name out loud since the trial ended, but it had lived in the back of my mind, like a splinter that can never be fully removed. We met at a small cafe in the park, neutral ground for both of us. Robert looked better than the last time I'd seen him. He'd lost weight, seemed more fit, and there was a certain spark in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," he said as we sat down at a table by the window. "What happened to Margaret?" I asked directly. There was no point in beating around the bush. He took a deep breath. "She died 3 days ago. Heart attack." I stayed silent, unsure what to say. What words fit a moment like this? My condolences? But was I truly saddened? I'm sorry? But did I really mean it? "Before she died, she asked me to give you something," Robert continued. He pulled a small envelope from his bag. "It's a letter, and this." He placed an old photograph next to the envelope in a simple wooden frame. It showed a young Margaret, I barely recognized her, holding a newborn. Her face radiated that particular joy only brand new mothers possess. "Is that you?" I asked, pointing to the baby. "No," Robert shook his head. "That's my older brother, James." He paused, as if gathering his thoughts. After the funeral, I was going through her things and found a diary. She kept it for years. "Anna, did you know Margaret had 3 children?" I looked at him in surprise. "I thought it was just you and James." "She had a daughter, Emily. She died in infancy from a rare endocrine disorder, a hormonal imbalance they couldn't diagnose at the time. Emily was 8 months old." I felt something tighten inside. From her diary, I learned that my mother never recovered from that loss. All her life, she lived in fear that it could happen again, to her grandchildren, that it might be hereditary. He ran a hand through his hair, a familiar gesture I remembered. "It doesn't justify what she did to you or to Elizabeth, but maybe it explains it. Her fear of a possible illness in her grandchildren turned into obsession. She became convinced she could identify the right kind of mother, one who would bear healthy children. It's madness, I know, but to her, it had a twisted kind of logic." I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in 4, covered in small, neat handwriting. "Anna, I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I'm not seeking it. I didn't have the courage to say this while I was alive, so I'm saying it now. I'm sorry for the pain I caused you, for trying to control my sons' lives out of fear of losing their children the way I lost my daughter. You were right when you said that my obsession didn't just ruin your life, but also my own and my sons' lives. Since then, I've often thought about what you said during our last meeting, that you and Robert might have had children, if only I had given you time. That thought haunted me. Maybe my fears cost me the chance to ever see the grandchildren I so desperately wanted. I hope you've built a new life, and that one day you might find in your heart, if not forgiveness, then at least understanding. Margaret." I read the letter twice, feeling a tangle of emotions rise in me: anger, pity, relief, and deep down, a flicker of the understanding Margaret had written about. "I lacked context," I finally said. "All this time, I only saw her as a monster, not as a person with her own pain and fears." "Me too," Robert replied softly. "She was my mother, but I never really knew her." We sat in silence, each lost in our thoughts. "How are you?" he asked at last. "I saw the article about your project. It's impressive." "Yes, things are good," I nodded. "Work, new projects, my own studio. I'm happy, Robert." "I'm glad for you," he smiled, and there was no trace of insincerity in it. "Really glad." When we said goodbye, he hugged me awkwardly, not like an ex-husband, but like an old friend with whom you share a deep, complicated past. "You know what's ironic," he said. "All her life, my mother was afraid of losing control, and that's exactly what happened. But you, after everything she did, you came out the other side in control of your own life." I reflected on his words. It's not about control, Robert. It's about freedom. Freedom to choose your own path without constantly looking over your shoulder at someone else's expectations. Freedom to build a future that isn't defined by past wounds. That evening, I sat on the terrace of my new apartment, spacious, with high ceilings and large windows, the one I had designed for myself. In my hands, I held the photograph of Margaret holding baby James. I thought about the cycles of pain passed down through generations, how the fear of loss can distort love beyond recognition, how sometimes the most destructive actions come from the best intentions. Fate had given me a second chance, a new life, free from manipulation and toxic ties, but it had also given me a deeper understanding of human nature, an understanding that behind every story there is another, and another after that, an endless chain of cause and effect. I hadn't forgiven Margaret, and I wasn't sure I ever would, but I had started to understand her, and maybe that understanding was more important than forgiveness. It offered the chance to break the chain of pain, to avoid repeating the mistakes of others, to build something new on the ruins of the past. After all, isn't that what I did as an architect? Wasn't that the true second chance? The ability to create something beautiful where there had once been only wreckage? I placed the photo on a shelf beside my professional awards and sketches of future projects, not as a reminder of pain, but as a lesson, as a part of the story that had made me who I am today. Outside, the last light of the sunset painted the city in shades of gold and violet. A new day was waiting, and it belonged to me, fully and completely. If you enjoyed the video, please support it with a like and a comment.